Okay, welcome everybody. We appreciate everybody being here tonight and to have such a nice turnout this evening. And I think that's because this is really a topic that is on everybody's mind. Thank God so many of us have been able to be vaccinated. And also, I think just from a standpoint, I'll say this as a doctor, just watching what's happened in the last year and really the miracle of science that, this vaccine, so many of these vaccines came out and that we were able to be vaccinated is really quite amazing. And so tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Teena Lerner, who I know many of you know. You can read her very impressive bio on our flyer, but certainly she's very, very qualified to speak to us on tonight's topic, which is, you're vaccinated, now what? A guide for the perplexed. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Teena's going to speak first. She has a couple of slides to show, which I'll share when she asks me to. And then if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And when she's done speaking, I will moderate the questions and read them out loud for her. And this also will be recorded so that as I know this will be an impressive presentation, you can share this later with friends and family. It will be on the Riverdale Minion YouTube channel. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Teena Lerner.
Thank you. And thank you all, really, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm competing with no one less than the President of the United States, so I really appreciate that you chose to pick to tune into this one instead. So I hope to accomplish three things tonight. I'd like to explain about the COVID vaccines, what they're all about and how they came to be, and really, just like Yardena said, to give you an appreciation for the amazing science that went into this and that brought this all about in such a short amount of time. And secondly, I want to provide you all with an understanding for what the vaccine means for you personally and the parameters for your own risk assessment. So I'm coming at this from the perspective that every adult has agency to decide what risks he or she is willing to take for themselves, not talking about risking other people, but what they want to take for themselves, and what those risks are or aren't now that you're vaccinated. And third, hopefully leave enough time to answer as many questions as we can. I will do that to the best of my ability and knowledge, with the understanding that there are still a lot of unknowns out there. Before I start, I have some major caveats. Number one, I'm not Dr. Fauci, and I don't presume to set policy or speak for like the CDC or any public health or any other institution. And those institutions all have very, very important roles to perform, and they're charged with making decisions for the benefit and the health of the public at large. But this conversation is just me, sharing my insights for you to use in your personal decision-making, focused on the private space, your own activities, your home, your family. And number two, everything that I'm saying here today is based on my reading of the literature and my personal understanding of the science as of today, March 11th, 2021. And depending on what new information comes out in the future, my comments today may be whatever, obsolete or wrong, but we're going to go with the best information that we have currently, and everybody has to be willing to modify when new data comes forward. Okay, so about those vaccines. I'm going to back up for a second to talk about vaccines in general, so you have some context to really appreciate the amazing breakthroughs that we have all witnessed this year. The history of vaccines dates back to 1796, when Edward Jenner famously injected material from the cowpox pustules into humans to prevent smallpox in humans. And for the next 215 years and counting, the rationale is still holding up quite well. You prepare some material that comes from the offending pathogen, or it's similar enough to that pathogen, inject it into an unaffected person, and let that person's immune system recognize the material as foreign. The next time that person is exposed to this foreign substance, let's say when they get the real infection, the immune system recognizes that it has seen this before and immediately springs into action, killing off the infection before it can really take root. So how does the immune system do that? A foreign substance, which in most cases is a protein or part of a protein, stimulates the immune system to create a bunch of highly specific antibodies that will specifically attach to different regions of that protein. The antibodies then envelop the foreign material, and by doing so, usually render the foreign material harmless. In addition, the mere presence of a bunch of antibodies attached to something is now a signal to the rest of the immune system to rev up. The activated immune system triggers a whole lot of things that ultimately result in the destruction of the foreign material. Most importantly, if this happens one time, the immune cells will remember, they have memory, and they remember this particular foreign substance and will react strongly the next time it appears. So antibodies are one component of the immune response. They're highly specific and will only stick to the specific target that they're programmed for. In general, your body will make a multiplicity of different antibodies in response to any one foreign substance, and each antibody recognizing a particular part of that foreign substance. Then there's also the non-specific rest of the immune system, which is comprised of T cells, macrophages, various cytokines, and a whole bunch of other factors. And they have various destructive functions and are alerted to go active when they see that antibodies are on the scene. So think about a car that's illegally parked on the street. Okay, stay with me on this. There's a cop on the street who interprets the crazy intricacies of the sign and determines if that car belongs there or not. And if he determines that it's parked against the rules, the cop writes a ticket and puts it on the windshield. And now that car is marked. Then think about the tow truck driver. They're not really up on all the various details of what's on the street sign. But if they see a pile of orange tickets on the windshield, well, you know what happens. So the immune system works the same way. Historically, vaccines used material from dead virus or live virus that was rendered non-pathogenic. Most of our childhood vaccines are based on that. And more recently, the technology has moved away from dealing with actual virus and towards synthetically producing the proteins of the virus. And then using these synthetically produced proteins or protein fragments as the vaccine material. And this is the case with some of the more modern vaccines, some of the more modern flu vaccines, the shingles vaccine, the HPV vaccine. They're safer to manufacture, they're more potent, they're a lot more consistent. And then at some point in the past 10 years, the following idea began to percolate. Well, what happens if instead of injecting the protein, why don't we inject the instructions for making the protein? Okay, so for now, let's go back to 9th grade biology. Genetic sequences are encoded in DNA, which sits in the nucleus. The DNA code gets transcribed into RNA. The RNA moves out of the nucleus and into the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the space between the nucleus and the outside border of the cell. And the RNA code is decoded by cellular machinery in the cytoplasm to manufacture a protein. So nowadays, DNA and RNA codes are widely known. They're very easily manipulated. So what if we put the code for a protein of interest into DNA or RNA and somehow manage to get that DNA or RNA into the right place in the cell and let the body's normal process take over? The cell would make the protein and the immune system would recognize the protein as foreign. And then the immune system will do its thing. Sounds cool, but could that even work? Fast forward to 2019. The DNA and RNA vaccine technologies were moving along very slowly, as vaccine studies typically go. But they were in early human clinical studies for diseases such as Ebola and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. And then in January of 2020, when the genetic code for the newly discovered coronavirus became widely available, those vaccine companies did a hard pivot. They dropped everything and switched over to the new coronavirus. And with the sequence in hand, it really was rather trivial for them to reconfigure their existing DNA or RNA vaccine to the new virus. It was also clear from the sequences and the prior knowledge of coronaviruses in general that SARS-CoV-2 had a particular protein that was the bad actor. The protein known as spike protein or S protein is the mushroom-shaped structure that you've seen a million times on all the pictures of coronaviruses. It's the viral protein that's responsible for binding to human cells and then entering the human cells, thus initiating an infection. So the vaccination strategy was very clear. Get the human body to produce antibodies to the spike protein. That's basically the key to the whole program. This way, if that person is ever confronted with real SARS-CoV-2 virus, his or her body will recognize the spike protein, will recognize that spike protein on the surface and send in an army of antibodies. And if the virus is full of antibodies sticking to its spike protein, the spike protein is now blocked and the virus will be unable to enter the human cells. In addition, the antibody-covered viruses will cause the rest of the immune system, the tow trucks, to come on board and destroy the virus. So how do we get the body to make antibodies to spike? Again, let's go back to high school biology. We can inject spike protein, and that will cause anti-spike antibodies to be produced. Or maybe we provide RNA that codes for spike, which will cause spike protein to be produced, which will then cause spike antibodies to be produced. Or we can provide DNA codes for spike, which will cause spike RNA to be produced, which will cause spike protein to be produced, which will cause spike antibodies to be produced. I mean, that's how it goes. So the bottom line is that we need spike antibodies, and there are several ways to get there. Surprisingly, the RNA vaccines, which are the newest technology with literally the least amount of prior experience, developed the fastest. And those were the ones by Pfizer and Moderna, which are basically very, very similar to each other. It's kind of like a who would have thunk it thing, like that you could actually inject an RNA sequence, protect it just enough so that it doesn't get destroyed before it reaches some willing cells, and then without any special prodding or tweaking, it just enters the cell, directs the production of its protein, and the protein makes its way out of the cell and stimulates the production of antibodies. Really? Would it even work? Apparently it did. And then the DNA vaccines came along. Those were being developed by J&J and AstraZeneca. Again, both companies' products are very similar to each other. DNA vaccines are a little different, and they have to get to the nucleus, so they have to have a mechanism to get there, and both of these companies use a very similar harmless virus to essentially transport the DNA into the nucleus. Once it's in the nucleus, the spike DNA makes spike RNA, which then directs the production of spike protein, which then leads to antibodies. And finally, the most traditional of the technologies, using the spike protein itself as the material to inject, really just began is still in clinical trial. There's a company Novavax, as well as Glaxo together with Sanofi together with Glaxo, which have candidates of this type in clinical trials. The spike protein is injected, which then leads to the production of spike antibodies, and we're on our way. So although we have many different vaccines and vaccine types, they all ultimately result in immunity by the same mechanism. They all have the same common end pathway, namely the production of antibodies against the coronavirus spike protein. So how do these vaccines perform in real life? At this point, there's a tremendous data out there, and we can draw a lot of conclusions. Firstly, to get an FDA approval in the United States, each company had to do a very large placebo-controlled study. Pfizer did 44,000 patients. Moderna did 30,000 patients. Johnson & Johnson did 40,000 patients. AstraZeneca has a 30,000 patient study in process, as well as a 9,000 patient study in the UK and South Africa that they had previously reported. And Novavax has a 30,000 patient study ongoing. And now that these vaccines are on the market, we also have real life data. So as of yesterday, 320 million shots have been given worldwide. of which 94 million in the US, 24 million in the UK, 9 million in Israel. The US does not have a really good centralized repository of data, but 95 million is a lot of shots, so there actually is a lot of observational data there. For example, we now know that the rate of anaphylaxis occurs in approximately 10 per million. And we know a lot of other details. However, in the UK and Israel, both of those countries have very strong national healthcare systems with highly sophisticated data collection, and both countries are currently generating meaningful real-life information. So what is it that we know? So let's look at the Pfizer clinical trial. So this is slide 1, Yardena. And this is actually my favorite graph. So the red is vaccine, are vaccinated patients. The blue is the unvaccinated patients. The bottom x-axis is time. And when this got published in December in the New England Journal of Medicine, and then it also was presented at an FDA meeting in December. And literally when people saw this graph, like their mouths dropped. We've never seen such amazing vaccine data before. Basically what it shows, the left part of the graph, which is day 0 to 14, the two lines are nearly completely overlapping, which means that the number of infections that occurred in both groups during the first 14 days was identical. And then after 14 days, they diverged dramatically. And as you see, the red line stayed pretty flat, which means that the number, they got very few new cases after that 14-day period. And the second shot was on day 21. The actual numbers in there were a total in this group of 22,000 in each, so 44,000 altogether. There were 50 infections in the vaccine group versus 275 in the placebo. I mean, that works out to an 82% reduction, but that was over the entire time course. If you break it down to different periods, from day 0 to day 21, 21 being the date of the second shot, there were 39 in the vaccinated versus 82 in the placebo. So, a little more than 50%. But starting on day 21, from day 21 to day 28, so the first 7 days after the second shot, there were 2 infections in the vaccine group and 21 in the placebo. And then once you got beyond day 28, so on this graph, day 28 to day 120, there were only 9 in the vaccinated versus 172 in the placebo, and that's your 92% reduction. So I wanted to emphasize that a 90, whatever the number is, that was 94% reduction. That like a 95% reduction does not mean that you have a 5% chance, 1 in 20 of getting COVID. It just means that you have that whatever the probability, their baseline probability of getting COVID, which is a relatively low number. It might be 0.5%, it might be 1%, it might be 2%, it might be 3%. But that whatever that number is, it's reduced further by 95% to a smaller number, which is basically like moving it over 2 decimal places. Subsequent to this, Moderna published a virtually identical graph, and a couple of months later, J&J showed very similar graphs. Okay, that we can take the slide off. So even though the clinical trials were done in a very short period of time, numbers of people were huge, and the data was so strong. So we had a huge body of patient experience, very strong patient experience before the vaccines got launched. Now, more recently, the Clalit Kupat Cholim in Israel published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine documenting their preliminary real-world data. So they reported on 1.2 million people. So that makes our 40K clinical trial look like nothing. So they report on 1.2 million subjects done between December 20th and February 1st. 600,000 received the Pfizer vaccine and 600,000 were unvaccinated matched controls. And then amazingly, the percentages held up. After day 28, 7 days after the second shot, a 92% reduction in documented infections, 94% reduction in symptomatic infections, 87% reduction in hospitalizations, 92% reduction in severe disease. The number of deaths was too low to make a statistical comparison. Their graphs basically look the same as Pfizer's, but with much bigger numbers. The raw numbers are also quite remarkable. Out of the 600,000 subjects in each group, if you looked at up to day 28, there was 2,373 symptomatic infections in the vaccinated versus 3,433 in the unvaccinated. That's really only like a 30% reduction. But after day 28, there were 16 infections in the vaccinated versus 174 in the unvaccinated, which is where you get your 90+% reduction. And then additional data has been dripping out of Israel. Just this morning, Pfizer and the Israeli Ministry of Health announced an update to this data. They announced that during the period January 17th to March 6th, so like that's literally 5 days ago, the fully vaccinated people experienced a 97% reduction in asymptomatic infections. I'm not exactly sure how they measured it because this wasn't a paper, it was just like a press release. But eventually it'll be followed up with a paper. And really it's hugely important, as I'll get to in a minute. In other announcements out of Israel, hospitalized patients are now almost exclusively under 50 years old, meaning that all the over 50s are already vaccinated and they're not in the hospital. 97% of COVID patients currently in Israeli hospitals are either unvaccinated or not fully vaccinated. So it's kind of the same different spin on the same thing. And most interesting, a paper published by one of the major PCR testing labs in Israel reported a dramatic drop in viral loads when vaccinated individuals tested positive on PCR. I'm going to get to that in a little while, but that's also very, very significant. Likewise, from the UK, Scotland is reporting an 85% to 90% drop in hospitalizations after the first dose of Pfizer or AstraZeneca vaccines. For those who want to follow the Israeli experience, because they're really generating data like crazy, this website is totally amazing. Yardena, it's slide 2. I didn't put the URL there because it's long, but you can get there by going to the Times of Israel website. And in the Times of Israel website has a big yellow box of COVID data. On the right side of it, there are links. And this one is called Health Ministry Stats Hebrew. I can't go through it all right now, but there's such a wealth of information in these charts. And actually, it's my go-to website for monitoring the pandemic. It shows data on hospitalized patients, how many in the ICU, and you can track it by day, you can track it by week, by month, since the beginning of the epidemic, all sorts of data on the hospitals in Israel, etc. But anyway, it's super interesting. If you can read Hebrew and understand it, it's really great information. Okay, and you can pull the slide. So really, we can go on and on with data that will make our head spin, but what can we conclude? So I think there are a lot of very strong conclusions. One, a vaccinated person has a dramatically lower chance of getting infected, something 90% plus lower chance. And if you do get infected, you really won't get sick. The chance of needing hospitalization is extremely low. In the Israeli study of 600,000 subjects, well, 1.2 million subjects, there were only 2 hospitalizations after day 28. And we could assume that if they were that their infection, since they ended up in the hospital, their infection might have started 2 weeks before or a week before. So it was very likely that their infection occurred before they got fully vaccinated. And I think we can conclusively say that the chance of death is near 0. So if you're fully vaccinated, you are no longer at risk of all those horrible outcomes that we were all so worried about. Your risk is now below the level of getting the flu and below the level of serious outcomes from the flu. You can all go back to the grocery store, the gym, the barbershop, the nail salon. You can get on a plane without worrying about a bad outcome. And as the CDC now agrees, you can mingle with other fully vaccinated people without masking and distancing because none of you is at risk. But what about mingling with unvaccinated people? And what's the story with transmission? So first, straight up, you can mingle with unvaccinated people with no risk to yourself. So you are not at risk if you hug those children or those grandchildren. Um, as you mingle with unvaccinated people, the more people you mingle with, yes, the risk gets a little bigger, but it's really not a lot. It's really not a big risk. A few unvaccinated people, no big increase in risk. A few dozen, still not really a big risk. Going to a restaurant indoors, it's your personal call. Me personally, I'm very comfortable. I kind of go with the science. I believe the science. When the science told me to stay home and that everything was scary, I believed it. And now when the science tells me that it's okay, I believe that too. But anyway, that's really a personal decision. And everybody should really decide for themselves. And of course, if you're uncomfortable, there are the usual mitigation strategies, outdoors, distancing, maskings, all of which reduce the risk way down. On the other hand, if you go into an indoor concert venue for several hours with thousands of unmasked people, 80% of whom are unvaccinated, I mean, you might as well check yourself into the hospital. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, but what about, so that's the risk to you as the vaccinated person. What about the risk to the unvaccinated person? So here's where it gets more nuanced and more personal. First, can a vaccinated person transmit to an unvaccinated person? Okay, it's theoretically possible, but the probability is quite remote. The likelihood approaches many activities that we readily undertake despite all the risks. The chance of getting struck by lightning is 1 in 500,000 every year. The chance of a pedestrian getting hit by a car is 1 in 5,000. By the way, I didn't know that. That's really very high. I think I have to be more careful when I cross the street now. But the chance of transmission, we don't know what it is. It's somewhere in between those, and I suspect it's closer to the lightning strike. Because if you think about how the vaccine works and how immunity works, so it's not like if you're vaccinated, you're walking around with this protective shield of armor and everything is bouncing off like Superman. Rather, if the virus gets into you, your immune system will recognize it and immediately fight it off. And that explains why some people did, in fact, get infected in the studies and in real life, and even had symptomatic infections. I'm assuming that for some reason their immune response was not as strong or not as quick, and the infection was able to begin, but ultimately it was cleared before the situation got too serious. So it is conceivable that a vaccinated person can be harboring an infection, and at that particular moment in time transmit it to somebody else. But firstly, this is a very hard thing to prove or disprove. Although there are some studies trying to get at like correlates of that, but we have no solid data. However, there are a lot of reasons to believe that it's really not happening, that transmission is really not happening. Firstly, just the stars really have to align just so for that to happen. The vaccinated person has to have a sufficient viral load to infect another person, and this would be happening at a time when the vaccinated person's immune system is actively fighting off this virus and reducing the viral load. Then the unvaccinated person has to show up in the vicinity just at that right time and actually receive a viral dose that's large enough to cause an infection. So, I mean, all of these are possible, but for all of it to happen, it really makes it very unlikely. We're not hearing like a groundswell of reports of people who got infected from vaccinated family members or vaccinated close contacts. Now, this is very, it's an anecdotal point, but with 300 million or more shots administered worldwide, if this was rampant, we'd know about it. And then more and more real world studies are reporting that both asymptomatic and symptomatic infections are dramatically reduced in fully vaccinated people. So if there's no infection, where there's no infection, there's no possibility of an inadvertent transmission. And then finally, this Israeli study that I mentioned about the viral load is very significant. So a PCR test determines if there's viral DNA, in your sample, the nasal sample. It can't tell if if the viral DNA, well, it tests for RNA or DNA. It tests if the RNA is from a live virus or a dead virus. It just tests that the RNA is there. Normally, it's not quantitative, but there are ways to tell whether how high or low the viral load is by how many cycles the machine has to do in order to be able to detect RNA. So in a preliminary study, which was published from Israel, from the lab that does the most PCR tests in Israel, they showed that during the first month of vaccination, so during that first month, very few people were double vaccinated, they were single vaccinated. But even during that first month, the viral load in the people who ended up testing PCR positive was anywhere from 2 to 20 times lower than the unvaccinated people. And I'm sure that more of this kind of data will be forthcoming. So the most likely scenario, which is not yet proven, is that it is possible for a vaccinated person to be PCR positive. We know that's true, but that he or she is unlikely to be making enough live virus to be of danger to other people. And I'm saying this for asymptomatic people. So if for some reason there's a vaccinated person who has COVID symptoms, that's a different story. We should consider him or her potentially infectious, and that person should not mingle with unvaccinated people until that situation clears up. But back to the question, who can mingle and who can participate in a Seder together? It's up to everybody really to make their own risk assessments. The unvaccinated person has to decide if he believes that the vaccinated person can transmit. If he concludes that the risk is on the order of a lightning strike and wants to take that risk, then he or she can mingle with vaccinated people without incurring any undue risk. Likewise, one unvaccinated family who typically mingles at home amongst themselves should feel comfortable in the presence of an unmasked vaccinated person or group of vaccinated people. It gets a little more dicey when you start thinking about the mingling of unvaccinated people from different households who would want to mingle with vaccinated people, for example, in a multi-household Seder. The risk is not to the vaccinated people. The risk is to the non-household, non-vaccinated ones. They still have the risk of getting infected from each other. So each family has to figure out the dynamic and who's who and what's what for themselves. And what about the children? So in this case, parents actually will have to make a risk assessment on behalf of their children. In a Seder scenario where all the adults in the group are vaccinated and only the kids from one household are not, there's no real risk. In a multi-household scenario where some or all of the adults are vaccinated and kids from different households are not, I think every family, has to do their own risk assessment. The unvaccinated adults have to decide for themselves if they're willing to participate in such a Seder with others and under what conditions. The parents will have to weigh the risks and consequence of kids getting infected. On the one hand, if a child gets infected, the probability is overwhelming that it will be mild and almost inconsequential. But that child's infection can result in the quarantine of other people, adults or classmates. So parents need to be mindful and appropriately weigh all the risks and consequences. I think everyone has the right to take appropriate risks for themselves or their own children, but you don't have the liberty to take risks on behalf of others. Now, of course, one can reduce the risk by testing everybody in advance. That definitely reduces the risk. It doesn't eliminate it entirely. School doesn't start for over a week after the Seder. So if your kid does get infected, you'll most likely know before he or she would go back to school and risk exposing the classmates. But that wouldn't prevent exposure and quarantine of any unvaccinated people that would have been at that Seder should someone have been infected. So, everybody's got to think about all the possibilities and the status of the different people sitting at the Seder and decide what to do. Next question. What about unvaccinated people who had a prior COVID infection? So nobody has studied it as carefully as as they studied vaccinated people, but I believe that we can consider them in the same category as vaccinated people with all the same risk assessments as I just listed above. The US CDC feels that they feel that way about anyone who's had COVID in the last 90 days, that they're immune. Israel considers people immune if they had COVID in the past 6 months. There are antibody studies out of the Rockefeller that document that antibodies remain highly potent 6 months out, even if the blood levels have dropped. And that study was done in November when the epidemic was 6 months old. So now I'm sure they're going to be updating it for the 1-year time point. So nobody knows how long the immunity lasts. We'll actually know when it stops lasting, and then we know that the durability ended. But observationally, we're still not seeing reports of large numbers of COVID reinfections, and the epidemic is now 1 year old. So far, so good. Finally, one last topic, variants. I'm sure it's on everybody's mind. So viruses mutate all the time. Some mutations confer poorer survival of the virus, and those virus mutants just die out. And some mutations confer advantages to the virus, either in its reproduction or in binding to human cells or other processes that the virus uses. And those will multiply like crazy and drown out all the others. So it's much like weeds in a garden. The fastest growing and the most resilient will take over your garden. We don't have all the answers in terms of performance of vaccines versus every single variant. The vaccines were all designed to elicit a crazy high level of antibodies and immune response. So even if the immune response and antibody binding is reduced in the presence of some of these variants, it's expected to be enough, the vaccine is expected to have enough power to overcome the infection. The 94 to 97% numbers in Israel were all recorded in the last couple of months now, despite the prevalence of the UK variant, which is highly infectious. It appears that all the vaccines do an adequate job against the various variants, with some variants, like the one from South Africa, seeming to be the most troublesome. But despite that, the studies of vaccines in South Africa, in particular the J&J, which was done recently in South Africa, have demonstrated nearly 100% reduction in deaths, in other words, no deaths, and extremely high reduction in hospitalizations, despite a lower reduction in infection. So in the J&J study in South Africa, they saw more like a 60% reduction in infections versus, something like 90%. But at the end of the day, the number of hospitalizations was, reduced to almost nothing, and certainly there were no deaths. In any case, all of the companies are developing second-generation vaccines to address these variants. So if a booster is required, let's say sometime next year, it will include ammunition against the new major variants. And finally, I just wanted to refer you to a couple of recent articles that you can easily find online. Slide 3. This one from the New York Times, it's dated March 6th. Here, Dana. Oh, there you go. Okay. It's titled What the Efficacy Numbers Mean. This article does a great job of explaining how to understand the meaning of efficacy and these percentages with very cool diagrams, and goes through the issues in trying to compare the different vaccine studies. And next one, slide 4. This one from the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday, March 9th. No. Okay. On Tuesday, March 9th, you can find it online. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal called How to Assess Risks. And it goes through a lot of the concepts that we were just discussing today. Oh, there it is. So feel free to try to find these articles. They're really very helpful. And thank you for your attention, and available for questions.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really just chock full of so much great information. I'm going to read through some of the questions here. Some of them were probably covered in what you said, but I think, these are things that people may want to hear again. So I think one question here that many people asked is, how long are we protected for once vaccinated?
Right. So the answer is that we don't know until there's an observation that they're not working that well. So I'd say, fortunately for all the people who got vaccines after they were launched, commercially, there's a group of people, these 44,000, who got vaccines 6 months, but not 6 months, like 3 or 4 months before them. The Moderna and the Pfizer studies began last June. Yeah, 6 months. They began last June. The commercialization was in December. So there's like a leading edge of people who are being monitored by the companies to see when their risk of infection increases. And that would be like the canary in the coal mine to tip off the companies and the scientific world that the protection is waning. So the assumption is that it's probably good for a year, maybe several years, but it's kind of like we'll know it when we see it.
Okay, another question here from JG. With the understanding that the first vaccine one can get is the best one, if you had all three vaccines in front of you, which one would you choose?
I mean, for sure, anybody should get whatever the vaccine they can get. And it gets very complicated to compare the studies. And that article in the New York Times that I referred you to is a good, goes through that analysis, because the Moderna and the Pfizer studies were done in the US during the period June through September or October. And the J&J study was done more like in September to December, and they had more participants in South Africa while that variant was raging. So their numbers are worse, but we don't know that their numbers, we don't know that the vaccine works any worse or better because they were done in different time points on different people. But they all work well and do the job that the vaccines are supposed to do, which is to really reduce the number of infection, virus floating around, and reduce infections and keep people out of the hospital. A lot there. I'm surprised actually how much excitement there is about having a one-shot deal, even if it, does have, 10 percentage points less reduction than the other. So maybe I'd say it's personal choice. The three on the market right now are all good.
There's a lot of questions here, which I'll sort of lump together, which I think are questions about now going back to public places. Like there was a specific mention about a concert. What about a gym? Is there a better mode of transportation? So I guess overall, what's your sense of sort of returning to these types of public spaces that many of us have been avoiding for, the past year?
So for now, the public health response is, obviously the masking mandate, certainly here in New York, the masking mandates are all in place because we're in a situation where the population, for all the 95 million shots that have been given in the United States, really only as of today, less than 10% of the US is fully vaccinated. And I think that's even true in New York State, So you have a population out there that's mostly unvaccinated. Everybody, the masking mandates and all will be in place. So certainly the unvaccinated people have to do that. In theory, the vaccinated people don't, but that's not going to happen when 90% of the population is unvaccinated. No one knows who's who. The majority are unvaccinated, so everybody should be wearing masks. So I would say that the vaccinated people can feel pretty safe in those environments because they're, everybody else is masking. I'd say, let's say on an airplane now, the ventilation system has really been improved in all the airplanes. And, it's certainly, you're not hearing about, when you hear about infections in airplanes, it's not this rampant thing that everybody's coming down, every flight is producing illness. So it's more of an episodic thing if somebody infectious gets on the plane. But I think that, the vaccinated people will be protected from that.
Thank you. And then a couple of questions about air travel that, it seems that we still need to, before someone travels, even if they are fully vaccinated 2 weeks after those vaccines, that they still would need to test prior to departure to travel to certain states, and also upon returning home. And, I guess the question is, when do we anticipate or think that maybe some of those things will start to change? But Yonina
Hmm.
Siegel just shared with us that apparently Governor Cuomo today said starting April 1st, quarantine for domestic travel to New York will no longer be required, and mandatory quarantine will remain for international travelers. The Department of Health still recommends quarantine as an added precaution, and all travelers must complete the traveler health form. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add to
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
point.
So I was going to say that like, especially the domestic travel quarantine rules that have been developed by each state are a little more political than medical. So, and the fact that they're all inconsistent, like New York has a different rule than New Jersey, than Connecticut, and all, which makes no sense because the virus really doesn't know where the Hudson River is and all of that. So those were, um, but the logic is making the assumption that, well, um, if somebody got infected on their trip, they should quarantine when they get home so as not to spread it to somebody else, because going on a trip was a higher risk activity. So first, let's say if we take New York State as an example, Cuomo relaxed it for vaccinated people, and now he's saying as of April 1st, he's getting rid of it altogether, but that everybody should, you know, be careful. And if there's any reason to be worried, they should quarantine. But if not, they're okay. Um, International travel, this is the US government, and now it's and a CDC rule that anybody entering this country has to have a negative COVID test. That seems reasonable. I know in Cuomo's announcement today that you just quoted, it says that there's a mandatory quarantine for people coming from mandatory quarantine of people coming from other countries to this country. I'm not 100% sure that's accurate, because I think it's recommended, but it's not mandatory. But I would have to check that.
Um, okay, if vaccinated people get together, do they still have to mask and distance?
Well, now even the CDC says that that's not required. So it's really not, if everyone is vaccinated, if everyone in the group is fully vaccinated, then, and I should say, I didn't say this before, I should say this now, like, everybody has to use seichel. Like if there's, if somebody is not 100%, has impairments in their immune system and is at a higher risk than average, then everybody else has to be really careful about that. Like, as I said, you don't want to risk other people's health, but assuming everybody in the group is of good health and has a sound immune system to their best of their knowledge, and they're fully vaccinated, none of those individuals is presenting a risk to each other, and they can go ahead and gather without the mask and distancing.
So I think that, answers one set of question in terms of, let's say individual adults who have been vaccinated. I think one question that has popped up here, and I think maybe a lot of people want answered, is what about, you have grown children who are vaccinated, but they have smaller children who are not vaccinated. And as the grandparent, you're vaccinated. So what happens if you want to go to their home? Should you still be masking and distancing, sharing meals? So there's that smaller group of small children who are not vaccinated in those scenarios.
Okay, so there, the risk is not to the adults, the risk is the children. And, I guess I hesitate to say anything since you're a pediatrician, but, I think that the family has to make a decision about what they think the risk is to their children in that situation. If you're describing a situation where all the adults are vaccinated, the parents are both vaccinated, the grandparents are both vaccinated, the children are not. So the parents of those children, have to make an assessment about how concerned they are, of the risk of their kids getting infected from this group, and what those consequences might be, and if they're willing to take that risk or not.
Yeah.
But there are many families that'll decide that these people, this vaccinated group of people, are not infectious, and they're not going to be, they're just not going to be infectious to the kids, and the risk is, negligible, or not any more maybe than what used to happen in the past when people had a risk of getting a flu or something like that.
Right. I would just add to that I think also the age of the children is important. So
Right.
talking about teenagers may be different. Again, I would tell everyone to talk about this with their own personal doctor.
Mhm.
But having a 17 and a 15-year-old in a house versus a 4-year-old and a, let's say a 9-month-old, you may do something a little bit different. And then I guess with that also, there's a question here. Do you have any thoughts on vaccines as it relates to younger children and teenagers?
Okay. So I just wanted to back up a second to what you just said, about the different ages of children, for sure, because all the data shows that um, adolescents, teenagers, let's say, I don't know what the cutoff is, not a hard cutoff, but let's call them 12 and up, are much more similar to adults in their ability to get infected and to transmit to somebody else and potentially be sicker. And as you said, the younger the children, um, the risks are less, and the type of disease they experience is really much milder. Um, and then the outlook for vaccines for the kids. So right now, both Pfizer and Moderna have studies ongoing for the 12 and up group. And those studies began several months ago, and both companies, I believe, have announced that those studies have ended or are near ending, which means that um, they wait for 2 months after that to see how many infections occurred or something like that. Then maybe this study doesn't require that. They may just be looking at antibodies. But the bottom line is, I believe that both companies are likely to have approval for their 12 and for 12 years old and up, probably before July. I also read that Israel announced that as soon as Pfizer completes the study and gives them the results, they're not going to wait for the US FDA approval. They're going to immediately approve it for 12-year-old and up. So, assuming that the safety in the 12-year-old and up is, on par with the adults, and the effectiveness is probably in the same ballpark as well, it seems that those kids should get it as soon as they can. They can experience disease just like an adult. They can transmit, and if we get those children vaccinated, that's a huge group of people that could potentially be, transmitters, and we can get that, taken care of. And then the 12 and under is going to take a lot more time because that didn't start yet.
Two questions about vaccines. What are your thoughts about the AstraZeneca vaccine? And is J&J vaccine considered a live vaccine?
Okay, so I'm going backwards. The J&J is not a live vaccine. The J&J has a virus, as like an adenovirus carrier that basically transports the DNA into the nucleus and then doesn't do anything. Like, live vaccines are vaccines that actually replicate. And this one doesn't replicate. It's like a one-way trip. It carries the DNA to a cell, to the nucleus, and then it can't go any further than that. And the product that the vaccine ultimately produces is, spike protein, which makes antibodies. So yeah, it's not considered a live vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine, we're waiting to see the results of their 30,000 person US study. I'll tell you that I have several family members who were in the AstraZeneca clinical trial and ultimately ended up with vaccine. My mom, my sister, and others. So my daughter. So, as far as I'm concerned, and they've been all of them have tested their antibodies to spike protein, and and my son, right? I forgot there's a lot of people on AstraZeneca in my family. Anyway, and the antibodies are, just as high as a recovered COVID patient, higher than a recovered COVID patient, as high as a Pfizer antibody, Pfizer vaccinated person. So, and it's very similar to J&J. The difference is that AstraZeneca is doing 2 doses. So I'm really curious to see if having a second dose of that type of vaccine will end up with better numbers, worse numbers, the same numbers. But AstraZeneca vaccine is being given widely in the UK right now.
2 questions that sort of address issues, I would say, on opposite ends of the COVID spectrum. One is about booster shots. Do you think they will eventually be recommended? And then the second question is, what about the news that came out recently that for people who had COVID, maybe only one vaccine is warranted and they don't need to do a 2-dose series for Pfizer or Moderna?
Right. It totally makes sense. And maybe people who already had COVID might preferentially want the J&J vaccine, since that they'll only get 1 shot. It totally makes medical and scientific sense. Nobody's done a study, so therefore the FDA and the public health agencies are not going to recommend a single Pfizer dose or a single Moderna dose, because there's no study to support that, even though it kind of makes a lot of sense. Where if somebody had COVID, if they get 1 shot of vaccine, it's like a booster, which would be equivalent to what people get now when they get 2 shots. And will we all need boosters, let's say a year from now? That'll depend on what happens.
One other question about pregnant women. Any thoughts about, the safety of pregnant women? I know that your daughter, Dr. Batsheva Maslow, did put in the chat, I think, a link to the CDC website about that. But do you want to comment at all about pregnant women getting the COVID vaccine?
Okay, so is Batsheva on this call? Because she can answer this question so much better than I can.
Batsheva, if you're on, please feel free to answer. I think she got off. I'm not sure.
Okay, so she's not on. She's
okay. Hi, I'm here.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Okay, so as I posted in the chat, the CDC has been following over 30,000 pregnant women who were voluntarily vaccinated over the last few months, who have been reporting their adverse events to the CDC reporting system. There was a recent publication that analyzed those data, and they demonstrated that of those 30,000 reports, there really was no significant difference in adverse events across all across all trimesters, compared to what we expect in the baseline. So we expect that there's a baseline level of miscarriages. We expect that there's a baseline level of, unfortunately, fetal demise and preterm delivery and preeclampsia. And in the vaccinated women, there was no difference. There's also an additional close to 2,000 women that have been recruited by the CDC to be part of an observational registry study. So they're following those pregnancies very carefully. And of them, already 235 have either delivered or their pregnancy came to its conclusion in one way, shape, or form. And they're also showing no difference in adverse outcomes. So that's an extraordinary data set that's very reassuring. It's really the best data set we have so far. Obviously, people are concerned whenever you are looking at treating a pregnant woman. You obviously have to think about there are 2 patients, basically, the woman and the baby. But what we do know is that COVID is extraordinarily dangerous in pregnant women. It's more so than in in women who are not pregnant, who have similar statistics. So similar health backgrounds and ages and other risks. pregnancy in and of itself is an independent risk for severe outcomes, including ICU admission, needing intubation, needing ECMO, death, preterm delivery, needing emergent delivery. And so that's a big risk. And there's some pretty significant data coming out of Israel that suggests that the newer variants could be potentially worse for pregnant women. So there's a whole population of pregnant women who are now admitted. There was in late January in Israel, there was a wave of pregnant women who got admitted to the hospital that was more significant than there had been in the past. And that's when the Israeli health ministry switched to essentially prioritizing pregnant women to get vaccinated. So the bottom line here is that while we don't totally, there isn't a study that was done particularly to include pregnant women. We could talk about for a long time why that was the case. But ultimately, the data that we have both directly from women who have already been vaccinated and everything we know about mRNA vaccines and adenovirus vaccines would support that the vaccine would be safe in all trimesters. And unless somebody is able to reduce their risk of exposure to COVID during a pregnancy to the degree that a vaccine could reduce their risk, meaning like if you could sequester yourself entirely away from any risk or decrease your risk by 95%, the vaccine is going to be the safer choice.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Here's another question. If someone recently had COVID, do they pose risk around vaccinated people?
Someone recently had COVID and recovered or is actively sick?
Or so let's say both scenarios. Let's say the first of actively sick, what should a vaccinated person do around them? And then I guess the second scenario, which I assume would probably be just, sort of following the same procedures of, quarantining and separating for 14 days, but let's say actively sick.
Yeah, if somebody's, it's like, obviously it wasn't studied. It wasn't part of the study. So, I think and this, scientifically, you would say that, the vaccinated person in close contact with the actively sick person has a 95% lower chance of getting COVID, but that situation is a riskier situation. So I would say that the vaccinated person should be super careful and probably, mask and take all the mitigation strategies while there's an actively sick person around them. Certainly no harm to do that, and probably, reduces their risk.
Any last questions? Okay, I think I got to everything. I just want to make just a few housekeeping announcements. Nina Siegel, who's been helping so many people in our community make appointments. So we'll just put a plug in that if you are having trouble, to encourage everyone to get vaccinated who's eligible. And if you're having trouble with that, please email info@theriverdaleMinion.org. And there are many people in our community and in the greater Riverdale community working to help people get vaccinated. So please email us if that's the case. And then I just want to again thank Dr. Lerner for speaking tonight. We will circulate the video of this if you want to send it with family. It will be in our YouTube channel. And then just to plug 2 other upcoming programs, on Saturday night, we'll be having our TRM Global Journeys with Dr. Zahavid Ben Hillel, who's the Israeli ambassador to Uzbekistan. And on Wednesday night, we'll be hearing from Dr. Shira Weiss for some pre-Pesach Torah. So thank you again, Teena. This really was just so informative. And maybe we'll do something again like this when new data comes out and there's some more changes. And so I'm inviting you back to do this again.
Okay.
in a
Thank
few
you. My
months.
pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.